Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Elena, and I'm representing the European Cultural Center today. So first of all, thank you so much for being here, either to the public and to the speakers, our guest of today, to the project Noonssup for organizing this event. I would like to introduce you to the one who will be then the moderator of the entire conference today. So Sasha Gibbs, art advisor and founder of Public Voice. I renew my happiness for having you all here. I think that it's going to be an interesting conversation. So also for the public, think about questions because I'm sure they will arise. And I don't steal any more time, and I give you the floor.
Thank you, Eleanor. Now, what a very select and special audience you are. So we are expecting you to engage, to ask questions, to heckle, to shout. So do move forward if you have any questions. So we're going to be looking at Korean art in the digital age. Really, our session today falls into two sections. The first section will be having presentations from our two experts in Korean art. We've got Rosalie Kim, who is curator of the Victoria and Albert Museum collection of Korean art in London. She's also the curator of the extremely important exhibition that some of you may have seen, Korean Wave. So this started off in London, it's now in the States. It is going to other countries, but I'm not allowed to tell you where. But anyway, extremely important exhibition, and we're very, very lucky to have Rosalie Kim with us today. Our second speaker will be Stephen McCoubrey. I've known Stephen quite a long time. Stephen was the curator of the UBS collection. You were in charge, or do we call you a curator of that, Steve? Yeah, you did it. Yeah. As well as an art consultant across the global art world, so a huge expert on contemporary art today. We'll also be hearing from two of our exhibited artists. I don't know whether any of you have had a chance to see the exhibition that's already showing in the next door room. Don't worry if you haven't, there will be time. We're having a 15-minute break after our presentations when you can go and grab a drink, use the toilets, and of course see more of their work. But we'll also be hearing from two of the artists who are exhibiting. So we'll be hearing from Garam Kim. So Garam, who is the most interesting multidisciplinary artist. Garam's work delves into social and cultural issues through an audience participation and performance. You won't necessarily be having to perform today, but her work is extremely interesting and, light-hearted, and I think you'll enjoy it. The second artist who we're really pleased to be hearing from is Bongsu Park, also another of the four artists. So Bongsu, again, is a contemporary artist, but combining traditional and new media to explore dreams, memory, and shared experience. So I think what I'll do is I will introduce the four exhibiting artists. We're going to have a look at a very short film that explains a bit about their work. But if I just tell you a bit more about the four artists. So the first artist you'll see is Daniel Sheen Lee. So Daniel is a DJ now. He was also a director, a concept director for many of the most famous manufactured bands in Korea. So clearly working in K-pop at a very influential level. What the video is looking at is the Korean underground nightclub scene. And there are, you may see similarities here between US prohibition. So, as we know, and the Italians I know are no different in this, if we are told not to do things, we often find a way. And Daniel's work is quite interesting, the impact of that on the underground culture scene. Secondly, we'll be looking at the work of Garam Kim. Garam Kim's work is often humorous, extremely accessible. She often steps out of the art context in order that many don't even see that they're in the art world at all, and we'll be talking more to Garam about her practice later and how she does this. The work that we're going to be looking at today is all around K-beauty. So Garam is exploring the impact of cosmetics, images, selfies on popular culture and art. The third work, quite different, but we'll be touching briefly when we hear from Rosalie on the impact of the Korean film world. Gyeon's No's work is quite reflective, but again in that great tradition of Korean storytelling, he's asking us to reflect perhaps on some of the progress that has happened so fast in Korea. We're looking at the peopleless landscapes of Gumi. So Gumi was really the largest industrial manufacturing city in South Korea. It's now a ghost town, but his very serene, thoughtful images help us look at progress and some of what gets left behind. Finally, we'll be hearing from Bongsu Park, who will be focusing in this piece of work on K-food. As I mentioned already, Bongsu is a contemporary artist, combining both traditional and new media. As you'll notice, she is also an amazing cook, and she grows everything. And so it's a really very interesting mixture of old and contemporary and how it all fits together. But Bongsu also works to explore the ideas of dreams and memory and shared experience and how we experience these. So I think we might start with the films now.
K-pop has taken the world by storm, but its roots run deep and are richly complex. In this episode, we'll dive into the fascinating blend of cultural influences and historical events that have shaped Korean pop music. From the Japanese occupation to the vital contributions of first and second generation Korean Americans, and the ongoing impact of the US military presence in Korea, these elements have woven together to create the vibrant tapestry of K-pop.
카리나나, 아이브 장원영, 그리고 뉴진스 혜린님 정도? 근데 최근에 한국 메이크업도 유행이 점점 더 내추럴해지고 더 자연스러워지고 있거든요.
If you are into makeup, selfies, or just curious about how art and social media collide, stick around. K-beauty has taken the world by storm, right? From glowing skin routines to that perfect glass skin look, it's all over Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. But it's not just influencers making this happen. Everyday people like us are also spreading the K-beauty love through our selfies and reviews. Social media has made it super easy to share beauty trends globally, and that's where Garam Kim comes in. She saw how people use makeup and selfies as forms of self-expression and decided to turn that into art. Garam Kim's selfie series is pretty unique. It all started with her piece, Star, where she didn't just create art for people to look at. She created art that you participate in. Visitors don't just work around. They use the makeup she provides, take selfies, and post them online. In a way, they become part of the artwork itself. It's like the ultimate mashup of K-beauty and social media, where the line between art and real life totally blurs. Makeup isn't just about looking good, at least not in Garam Kim's work. It's a tool for artistic expression. In our exhibitions, the makeup is an afterthought. It's central to the experience. Visitors use it to create their own look, snap a selfie, and in doing so, they complete the artwork.
Gumi, situated in the midwestern part of North Gyeongsang Province, South Korea, is well known for its light industry. A high school social studies textbook says that more than 69% of Gumi citizens are in their 30s or below, and Gumi has the highest proportion of women to men. The first-generation industrial complex was built in Gumi, and the city enjoyed economic development in the early 1970s. This resulted in the influx of young people who desired to work at Gumi's factories. I was born and grew up in the city of Gumi. Like other fathers in my generation, my father, too, wore more of a casual jacket than a business suit and did not come home when he worked on the night shift. Most of my friends who happened to be female took the same path as their fathers and chose work over university.
너무 신기하지 않아? 얘네들이 어떻게 그 작은 씨앗들이 이렇게 된대? 안에 뭐가 들었길래? 응?
My mother was young when my grandmother passed away. My aunt and uncle took on the role of parents to my mother. She was too innocent to grasp why her mother was always lying in bed, too sick to rise. There was a senbei snack factory near their home, and the air was often filled with the warm aroma of crackers being baked, flour, eggs, and sugar coming together in a fragrance that lingered in the streets. One day, grandmother, craving a treat, took some money from beneath her pillow and asked my mother to buy a senbei snack from that factory. Mother eagerly did so, not knowing if this could be the last time her mother would taste anything. That very day, grandmother passed away, unaware of death's meaning. My mother played in the yard, confused by the hushed atmosphere around her. As she grew older, she couldn't shake the thought. Perhaps it was the senbei snack that had caused her mother's death. The guilt lingered, and for years, the mere mention of the word Omma, mother, would bring her to tears. Yet, when she had her first child, my sister, the tears stopped, as if something deep within her had finally healed. My mother was young when grandmother. Every spring, my mum and I often climbed the local mountain together. We spent the day gathering mugwort, our fingers brushing against the cool, tender leaves. The warmth of the sun filtered through the trees, and the scent of the earth rose up. I loved hearing stories from her childhood as we picked the leaves. Her memories painted scenes in my mind, watching old dramas unfold. Time slipped away so quickly, and before we knew it, hours had passed. We always ended up collecting an enormous amount of mugwort. As the sun began to dip, we would gather the mugwort and bring it to the village. We boiled the mugwort in a borrowed cauldron, steam rising into the air of the mountains. Once it was cooked, we rinsed it carefully, draining away the water, and then carried it to the village mill. There, the mugwort was mixed into the dough, pounded until it became soft and warm. After all the process and waiting, the first bite, the fragrance of the mugwort filled my senses and was pure bliss. Mum and I exchanged a quiet, knowing glance, a smile forming on both our faces. Every spring, my mum and I often...
Thank you. Rosalie, we'd love to hear from you now, please.
Thank you.
Taken the world by storm.
As we know.
As we know. Well, I'm going to reuse that. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Sasha, and thank you very much to Bongsu and Karam for inviting me on this special occasion. And I was asked today to talk to you about our exhibition titled Hallyu, the Korean Wave, which took place at the V&A from September 2022 to June 2023. And it was considered as the first exhibition of its kind to celebrate and delve into Hallyu, which is the equivalent of the meteoric rise of popular culture from South Korea. And in fact, the first wave rippled across Asia in the late 1990s, led by K-drama and cinema, before reaching all shores around the world from the mid-2000s onwards, led this time by K-pop music, but buoyed by a young and tech-savvy generation making use of the emerging smartphone technologies and social media platforms. And today, Hallyu is challenging the global currents of pop culture, and this, in a nutshell, is what we are saying in the exhibition. So, in order to tell that story, we have divided the exhibition into 5 sections, starting with a very brief introduction, followed by a historical preamble that sets the scene to Hallyu, before diving into the first wave of K-drama and cinema, the second wave of K-pop music and its fandom, before finishing with the cultural impact of Hallyu on the beauty and fashion industries. So the exhibition started with something that hopefully anyone would recognize, which is Psy in his Gangnam style, not because he was the first K-pop idol, but because his music video, Gangnam Style, went viral back in 2012 and broke the YouTube play counter by 2014, but it firmly put South Korea on the global map of pop culture. And its lyrics on Gangnam Style is also a social-cultural commentary about the hyper-consumerism of Gangnam, which is actually, for those who haven't been to Seoul, it's a district located south of the River Han, which is considered today as the most affluent area on the whole of South Korea. So we juxtaposed a photograph of Gangnam today with its glitzy sort of skyscrapers, boutiques, cars, and then contrasted with this black and white photograph of Gangnam just 40 years prior in the late 1970s, early 80s, when it was still a rice paddy field with empty concrete shells of apartment blocks dotting the banks of the River Han. So we created this visual shock in order to talk about and dive into the compressed modern history of Korea, which in essence is a succession of traumatic events happening in the 20th century, starting with the colonial periods, lasting from 1910 to 1945, followed by the territorial division as an outcome of the Cold War taking place in the West. And then the Korean War, where the North is invading the South in the hope of sort of reunifying the peninsula under the communist banner. But this ends with an armistice 3 years later, which means that the two countries are still technically at war. So by the late 1950s, early 1960s, South Korea is poorer than North Korea. It has a GDP that is lower than that of Haiti or Ghana. And it's really rife. It's considered as a third world country, and it's a very rife position for a military coup d'etat to take place in 1961, and that will inaugurate virtually 30 years of military rule on South Korea. So during this time period, the first two sort of decades, 60s and 70s, is really focusing on the rapid economic recovery of South Korea. So there is a whole kind of system in place, and this is the time when the chaebols like Samsung, LG, and Hyundai comes to the fore as the engine of the recovery. And this is also, however, a time when there is a growing influx from the US and from Europe coming into the Korean peninsula through the American military bases. And so there is an influx of pop culture and material culture that is not sitting well with the local authority, because the liberal ideas are actually threatening their authority locally. So ensues a whole series of censorship on artistic expression, freedom of expressions, etc. So if the 60s and 70s about the economic recovery, the 1980s is in essence the democratization sort of decade. So there are a huge successions of numbers of movements, march, democracy movements that is taken forth by students, labor unions, and later on joined by the middle class in order to end the martial laws in Korea. And that will take place in 1987, just in time for the Summer Olympic Games of 1988, when South Korea is then propelled onto the international scene for the first time as a young democracy with a sound economy. That, however, is not going to last long. The euphoria comes to an end virtually 10 years later, when the Asian financial crisis hits South Korea in 1997. And you have the historic bailout from the International Monetary Fund. And coincidentally, ironically, at the same time, South Korea was hailed as the model to follow when it comes to ICT, so the information and communication technologies and the embrace of high-speed internet. And so in the late 1990s, many of the unemployed or many of the graduates coming out of the university who didn't have future perspectives would congregate into what we call the PC Bang, which in a way is a sort of a world template for internet cafes. And these were the place where at the time you had the latest computers, and you also had the high-speed internet technologies. And this is not just for urban areas, but also rural areas, because the Korean government was really dead set on having the whole country very much computer literate, because they were convinced that the colonial period in the early 20th century happened because they were too slow at embracing modernization. And so if a new revolution was going to take place, they wanted to be at the forefront. And so this is a time when a lot of Koreans are starting to converge into this PC Bang, and that's the beginning of online communities, esports, as well as cyber startups. And one of those cyber startups is actually Cyworld. Cyworld is one of the first social media platforms in Korea, which is the equivalent of today's Spotify, Bitcoin, Sims, and Facebook. So in essence, you can create your avatar. You can then go into a virtual shop, buy virtual flowers with your totori, which is your Korean Bitcoins. Then you would go to visit your friend in her virtual apartment and then look at the photographs of her latest trip while listening to the latest K-pop songs. So they were doing this already in the late 1990s. And by the early 2000s, virtually 80% of the Korean population was engaging with Cyworld on a daily basis, which means that by the time Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube catch up by 2005, Korea was very much really tech-savvy with anything related to internet and digital technologies. And you could see that reflected in the type of electronic consumer goods that is produced in Korea by that time. You have the first commercial MP3 players, the first TV mobile phones, the first capacitive touchscreens mobile phone that are just all produced in Korea. And these are actually going to affect the way you produce, distribute, and consume popular culture in South Korea first, but also globally. And so to make the point in that exhibition, we had a huge, massive installation from Baek Nam-jun, or Nam-jun Paik, who is considered as the father of video and media art, in essence. And this work that we had was called Mirage, and we had 33 TV screens that were showing different clips. And the essence of that message was that high forms of art, mass media, as well as popular culture will converge together through the sort of technology in order to create a new form of art, a new form of expression. And this, we thought, was really foresignificant of what happened with Hallyu. So this worked as a sort of hinge point between the historical section and the TV drama sections, which unfortunately I will jump because I was asked to focus on the K-pop music and its fandom. So jumping directly into the K-pop section, I didn't want to start this section with a music video or an idol of today. I wanted to start with this painting from the 1960s, 1963. It shows actually a young woman seated with a sort of westernized fashion on a chair, listening to music playing on an LP player in the background. But you can still see the Korean identity coming through the fore with the use of pandaji, the Korean traditional furnitures, as well as the iconic munjeol, which is associated with Korean cultural identity since the 17th century and particularly pushed forth since the 1930s. And so the point I wanted to make with this painting was that the notion of K-pop being hybrid is not just something that happened in the past 10 years when it started to come to the fore. It's something that is ingrained within Korean society much further back. And so from this point onwards, we looked at the evolution of popular songs in Korea that is affected, for example, during the colonial period with the emergence of trot, which is the Korean take on the Japanese enka, which itself was a Japanese take on Western popular music in the early 20th century. We then moved on to the sort of 1960s when Korean music scene was very much impacted by the American type of songs, the rocks, or the blues, the rhythms, and those kind of elements were actually also performed by Korean artists who were then called to perform on the US military bases in order to entertain the soldiers and the troops that were posted across of the South Korean part of the peninsula. And so these performers were actually singing in a language that they were not really accustomed to. They were just creating cover songs with traditional instruments, and they were dressed in hybrid clothing. So again, this hybridity is constantly here present. It's not something that is just happening in the past few years. And so we take it all the way to the 1990s, knowing and remembering that you had the military rule in place during that time. So the type of music that filtered in or were allowed to be played in public places were very limited. And so, very nice. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, when the censorship starts to be lifted, the Black American music started to trickle into South Korea. So reggae, R&B, hip hop, rap, anything that you can think of starts to really entice a young generation. And this will also impact the way you are producing music in Korea. And so you have entertainment companies coming to the fore, and the model has been broken by what we Satursday boys in English, who have really changed the way music is performed, popular music is performed, what is understood as Korean pop music, and how to address certain social issues with your lyrics, and in order to sort of create a closer tie with your audience. Bringing that to a sort of corporate scale is SM Entertainment with Isuman. And he is considered as the person who has created this Korean K-pop factory music, or music factory. But it's not, this is true, but this is not something that is just unique to Korea, because you have to think about the 1960s Motown in Detroit, Michigan, where the Black American artists had to break into the segregationist kind of period, where you had a mostly white audience, for example. You also had Socket Can and Waterman, the Britpop from the 1990s, and you also had the Johnnies from Japan in the 1980s. So Korea had the time to just absorb, look and analyze and improve the system, if you'd like, in the 1990s. But also this happened at a time when internet exploded, which means that the reach and impact went further, faster, at a scale that we have never seen before. And so we explain in the exhibition that K-pop is a whole kind of mixture of lyrics, fashions, music videos, sounds, and sleek choreography that are all actually centered around the concept of idols, who can be a physical person, but also a virtual person in the metaverse. And with the growth of the K-pop music on the international scene, the role of the idols are also growing, and they are becoming ambassadors for good causes, ambassadors for Korea, and which is in turn growing the sort of soft power of South Korea on the global scene. And K-pop wouldn't be where it is today without the support of its fandom. And the fandoms are no longer the groupies of the 1960s that you have in mind. They are way more strategically organized. And we show them as sort of artists, translators, philanthropists, and activists in the exhibitions, showing in this case how they have created an impact on the global scene, not just for the music scene, but also for causes that are much wider than the musical, because they were able to remobilize the online infrastructure that they are using to propagate K-pop to address socio-political or environmental issues that are dear to their hearts. And so we took some of the examples of the during the COVID time or during the Black Lives Matters movement as well. And so from this point onwards, we were concluding the exhibition with the beauty and fashion section. And in the beauty, we focused on showcasing the sort of deep relationship that the Hallyu industries had with the beauty industries. And it's not just a question of product placement, but it's also how they are weaving the plot lines into the K-dramas, or that some of the films or the K-dramas are also launching new movements. For example, the metrosexual man in Asia was launched in Korea, and for example, Chanel has launched their first male cosmetic campaign fronted by a Korean actor in Korea, because they knew the impact of that in the world. And so we looked at how this male cosmetic has been very much taken on board in Korea, how they are just coupling that with K-pop industries, and how they also went on to the gender fluid kind of makeup that is coming to the fore. And we also investigated K-beauty standards, regimens, as well as ingredients in traditional Korean cosmetics, and how that has been just transformed in the present day. And we also looked at the counter movement with the cosmetic surgeries, as well as the escape the corset movement that is just combating different types of beauty standards, and finished by a beautiful array of beauty packaging that can be inspired by traditional Korean craft technique, or very completely coming from a site. A fun packaging design, as well as the innovations like the cushion compact that has very much impacted the way people are using their foundations, and very much copied now by Western brands too. And we finished the exhibition with a colorful array of fashions, mainly divided into strands, hanbok, the historic Korean garments, as well as contemporary streetwears. And this is a very short, whirlwind tour of our exhibition. I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
I think we need a round of applause. I mean, really, if any of us were in any doubt as to why South Korea is leading the world, here is the answer. I mean, completely encyclopedic, amazing, and in 15 minutes flat. So anyway, what a treat. Thank you. Stephen, from your perspective, it'd be really helpful to see the impact of this stratospheric rise in digital Korean art and the impact it's had on the wider global art market from your perspective and, you know, your vision. To you.
Yes, no, great. Well, having had the whole history of post-war Korea in, you know, perfectly encapsulated and very short, I'm going to restrict myself, as you say, just to the art market, and that's and it is, I should say, something of a personal view of the Korean art market, and it starts and finishes where it does because it's about my own experiences of buying art on the market and dealing with Korean artists in other bits of the world. So when I first started buying art in Korea, working for the investment banking arm of the Swiss bank UBS, and we were doing a lot of new offices in Asia, and the only one that came up with their own ideas about what they wanted to hang on the walls that were not crazy was the Korean business, which had been established for over 15 years at that point, but was expanding rapidly. But I was pretty much well directed to say that we were going to buy all the art from the office from a gallery called Ghana Art, which was seen very much not just as a gallery, but as an advisory to corporations, to museums, to other worlds. But it became very quickly clear that there were very few other things happening outside of the horizon of people buying, Korean people buying Korean art. There was very little visibility, which was at that point not unusual in Asia, but certainly was very, very different from what was happening, particularly in China, but also beginning to happen in India and other places with galleries reaching out into the international art market. But really just this group of 5 galleries had any visibility at all. Gallery Hyundai had been showing a specific group of older artists, which I'll come to in a minute. Kukje, literally meaning international, was selling only international art and therefore wasn't really relevant for me. Arario, although one of my good friends was already working with Arario, bringing their artists into New York and New York artists into their program. But you had a really small scene in terms of what was visible from the outside, and actually even that group were not particularly visible. I mean, they weren't doing major fairs, they weren't doing things that would allow them to be seen and allow Korean artists to be much more easily collected by other markets, other places in the world. But I mean, as Rosalie's actually sort of pointed out as well, particularly talking about Namjoon Pak, but there really not many other. If you asked somebody, particularly in the US art market in the year 2000, to name a Korean artist, I would say 99.9% of the answers would have been Namjoon Pak. After that, yes, Kwan Young-chun definitely, made a huge international impact. After that, I mean, Rosalie's given you a rough idea of where Namjoon Pak fits into the world. Kwan Young-chun makes these large sculptures and sort of relief works made of hundreds or even thousands of hand-wrapped and with string-wrapped packages with text all over them, which are then turned into these extraordinary abstracted kind of objects. But really, I think probably in 2007, when I first came to this market, those were probably, even for me, certainly the only 2 artists that I would have seen in a commercial environment anywhere outside of Korea, in New York or in London. But a change was about to happen at that point, and particularly Kukje Gallery and the related, literally related Tina Kim Gallery in New York started to promote the great group of abstract artists who'd been making work in the 60s and 70s and onwards. And the first artist that came to most people's view was Liu Fan, but was closely followed by many others. Park Sibo probably now the better known almost than Liu Fan, but there was a beginning of that movement. It was very organised by a handful of people, but what really changed the whole view, particularly of what would happen with Dansei-kwa, was Gutai from Japan, which was a very, very broad movement of lots and lots of conceptual artists and painters and all sorts of different things. Even flower arranging was allowed to be part of Gutai. But a vast exhibition was put on in the Guggenheim in New York, and that had already been picked up. There had been shows with Mega Gallery Hauser and Worth of Gutai before that, even in 2012. And suddenly, there was an understanding that there was such a thing as Asian modernism, and that it was mature, serious, large groups of artists rather than just outliers in terms of sort of Nemjin Pak and others, and that over about sort of a 10-year period from 2013-14. In some ways overtook Gutai quite quickly in terms of the marketability of it, that people were collecting that work. And I would say now, I mean, there's very few galleries in the top 10 commercial galleries in the world that don't have a Dansei-kwa artist on their books. And they themselves were in the main fortunate enough to have been able to enjoy that success, albeit often at the very end of their lives. And Liu Fan as the leader is very much still with us. But it's been very rare in the world for a completely unknown art movement like that to have gone from something that was really just the customers of Gallery Hyundai and to a lesser extent Kukje buying things because they were part of your own culture and a modern take on the Korean experience, and has now become pretty much something that's a central part of most, well, certainly those who are interested in painting collections. So, and I think it's extraordinary to have seen it happen so fast. And what's happening right here in Venice as well to some extent now is that although that was a very mature generation, there was a small, older generation, largely born sort of in the sort of World War I kind of era, who were left behind even to some extent by Dansei-kwa in the sense that, again, they were only really being collected by Korean institutions and serious Korean collectors. But that in the last decade or so, certainly, so Yu Young-kuk, who has an exhibition here in Venice at the moment, is very substantial, and lesser known, Xianjia Ri, who had moved to France and developed her painting practice in the south of France. I was very fortunate that her son asked me in about 2013, 2014 to help him bring her reputation into greater light, and I actually recommended he do exactly what they're doing at the moment with the Xianjia Ri Foundation in London, and use some of the techniques that the American artists were using to break the Asian market in reverse and to bring paid-for shows to the West. But this generation is, none of these artists have significant Western dealers yet, but as I've put this result from Christie's up now, I think when I first spoke to Mr. Shin, her son, the maximum value was perhaps $100,000 for a very rare painting, whereas now we're at $1 million, and for her compatriots, particularly Kim Wan-ki, is more like 10 million or 12 million for a major painting, and that's in the auction market, not even in private sale. So you've suddenly got, with Dansei-kwa and this group, an enormously highly valued, right up there with some of the most important American abstract artists of the same period in terms of how the market views them, and that's very international as well. I mean, there is a grounding in the Korean market that's pushing this forward, but Dansei-kwa being represented by White Cube with Park Sibo and a whole range of other important international galleries that have really changed the market for those artists. And around the time that this was really happening, I suppose, having moved away from that small handful of galleries in the late noughties, by the time we were getting up to sort of about 2015, 2016 era, we're starting to see a lot more Korean contemporary. The image there is actually one of the first times that I had, again, come across a Korean artist outside of Korea, which was at the Hayward Gallery as part of a mixed exhibition there from Do-Ho Seo. So second generation, really fantastic, and now US-based. Actually, no, he's in London now, isn't he? He's in Britain, yeah. That was the sort of beginning of trying to work out what the next step is for Korean artists. That's not just painting, and it's not just something that's very effectively a Western painting style taken into an Asian context. Really at this stage, even by 2013-14, I would say most of the mature economies in Asia had a bigger profile in the art market than Korea did for contemporary art. Japan had been the only country that had galleries going to big international art fairs like Art Basel and Frieze, and then India was perhaps a little bit behind it, and a little bit behind that, some of the Southeast Asian centers. And Korea was, despite its financial importance and its economic power and the beginning awareness, I guess, of a lot of K-culture coming through, as an art market, it didn't match that at all. But suddenly, again, that really started to push through, and even if the galleries weren't there, you were seeing artists like Do-Ho Seo, who was with Lim and Morpin, and a whole series of other artists. We've got Haegu Yang here, who is one of the sort of artists I probably bought in greater depth than any of the other Korean artists over about a sort of an 8 or 9 year period for UBS, and have bought work since as well for other people. But we have moved into this decade with Korean contemporary art now becoming, I would argue, the most visible Asian art market as far as the rest of the world is concerned, and I think there can no better example of that. The fact that when, in my hometown of London, you have Myra Lee in the Turbine Hall of Tate Modern, and across the road, Haegu Yang having a huge retrospective show at the Hayward Gallery. I would characterise those as the two most sort of visible exhibitions in the UK at the moment. And then jumping over to New York, Lee Bull, who was arguably the first person of this newer generation, along with Do-Ho Seo, to really kind of break the market in the West. She's got the facade commission at the Met Museum, which is, it's a relatively new. I think there's probably only been 4 before or something like that. But I mean, it's really visible. It's visible from the street. It gets a huge PR push behind it, and it's very, very visible. And then lastly, although it has just finished, so it wasn't concurrent with the other two, but Kim Soo-ja did a vast, again related vaguely here to the Pinot collection in Paris, a huge installation of mirroring the whole of the floor of the Bourse building, the stock exchange building that houses the collection there, and I saw that. I mean, way outside, again, in a K-pop world, way outside art media or anything like that. Must have been one of the most Instagram things in the world for a while. And then here in Venice for this year's Biennale, I mean, you cannot miss Korea. You have a huge variety of different things happening. Whether it's Xianzhou Rui and other members of that generation having solo shows, Li Bei having a big solo show, Guangzhou Biennale having a separate world, and then a very talked about Korean pavilion a very different take on how to put together a Venice Biennale pavilion, and all of that together puts it. I mean, it's almost impossible to avoid the conclusion that Korean art is at the moment. It's now outstripped the visibility of Chinese contemporary in a lot of ways. So these are those three big projects. You've got the Met, the Pinot collection, and Mara at Tate Modern. But as part of that evolution, there has been a certain amount where, despite the fact that Nam June Pak invented new media work and invented video art, a lot of the people who've so far made it into the most sort of high positions in the market from Korea have been using much more traditional materials, even if they've been doing so in very unusual ways, like Haegu Yang and again Mara Lee and Lee Bull. But there is definitely a next stage where technology is starting to really be widely used in intelligent and very different ways. So I think we're going to end up with a next generation of people, because technology is going to be part of everything. And you've got now, again, as Rosalie pointed out, almost a second generation now in Korea of people who were completely tech savvy, who understood social media, the best part of a decade before anybody else did, and understand technology in lots of different ways. You're starting to see certain artists sort of break through in that world. The extraordinary additional thing is that not only are Korean artists very visible in the rest of the world, more visible than almost any other, certainly Asian nation, and certainly, bar a few European countries and the US. The art market within Korea has exploded. It has been growing rapidly over the last decade, but in particular since the pandemic. Not only has there been a lot more, many more Korean domestically growing galleries, but almost every single major international art brand has moved into the market in Seoul. There are a few that are still sticking around in Hong Kong, but I mean the feeling is that probably even people like Gagosian who haven't made the move will, as they watch the market grow there. I think the establishment of Frieze Seoul in 2022. That Frieze chose Seoul. They didn't believe in Tokyo. They didn't believe that they could go near the domestic art fair market in China, in mainland China. It's almost a chicken and egg situation at that stage as well, where now that Frieze has chosen Korea, the market a much wider market will come to Seoul. But I think no one, certainly when I started buying work in Korea in 2007, would ever have predicted that. We were arguing about whether it might be Shanghai or Hong Kong. Although both of those places have very healthy art markets, they've also got an enormous number of other cultural issues that have kind of stood in the way in lots of different ways. But I think, compared to the first slide that I showed you, this is by no means all of them. I think that the head count, obviously not all of contemporary art, the head count of galleries in South Korea is something like 500 significant galleries now. But there are a handful of cities in the world that can boast a roster of global international galleries. And so we've gone from a stage where in 2007, perhaps one of the least visible of the new economies as far as the art market was concerned, to now we were almost going to discuss, well, where's in the lineup? Is it New York, London, Paris, Seoul? I mean, it really has got to that stage in a less than 20-year period, which I find fascinating, and it will be really, really interesting to see what happens next.
Brilliant. Thank you, Stephen. That's a really interesting perspective to balance our micro and our macro. I suggest we all take just a 10-minute break, get a warm drink, do some star jumps, warm up. We'll then come back and we're going to hear actually what's happening right now from two of our exhibiting artists, which will be really interesting. And we'll be asking more of our two panel speakers as to Korean art in the digital age. So yes, do come back and sit down. It's 5 o'clock now, so if we meet again at 5:10. Thank you.